Welcome back, folks. I'm J.B. Shreve, your host at the End of History podcast, theendofhistory.net, and we are continuing forward in our podcast series on the Empire, a 250-year American story. And so we're actually going back further than 250 years as we continue with this next episode today. We're going to look at the life of Columbus, the era of Columbus, and uncover a lot of what I think will be surprising details, surprising facts about the context behind what has weirdly become a controversial issue regarding Columbus and the New World and all of that. So that's coming in this episode. If you are not a Patreon subscriber of The End of History, I encourage you to do so. For as little as $1 a month, you can become a Patreon subscriber, Patreon supporter, become an End of History insider. You'll get daily, you'll be invited to a WhatsApp group where you get daily messages regarding 5 good reads for the day, some encouragement, biblical encouragement in the mornings. There's a lot of stuff you get access to, including all of our podcast history, podcast episodes, podcast series from the history of India, history of the Middle East, the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is just a lot out there. We've been doing this since 2012, so you can access all of that as a Patreon supporter and insider, and that's my plug. And let's go ahead and jump into today's episode.
This is the End of History.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. That was the little rhyme, the little ditty that a lot of us learned in grade school to help remember the historic event of Columbus, Christopher Columbus, discovering the New World in 1492. Every year, on the second Monday of October, we commemorate that occasion with Columbus Day. It's a legal holiday, right? And what I believe will probably be considered a weird aspect of our polarized times when we look back on it someday, the recognition of Columbus Day. Indeed, any level of recognizing Columbus's achievement more than half a millennia, 500 years ago, has become increasingly unpopular. It's really, to me, it's a strange front in the culture wars. In recent decades, celebrating Christopher Columbus has become increasingly controversial as historians and indigenous communities have highlighted the darker realities beyond or behind his voyages. While Columbus was long honored as the discoverer of the Americas, millions of indigenous people already lived across the continents. We've talked about that. And he never actually reached the world or reached what would become the future United States. He didn't get any further north than Cuba in his voyages. Critics argue that celebrating Columbus, Christopher Columbus, that celebrating him overlooks the violence that his expeditions unleashed. Columbus and his men, they enslaved indigenous peoples. They imposed brutal forced labor systems. They committed widespread atrocities, including torture, sexual violence. His arrival also accelerated the spread of European diseases that devastated native populations, opened the door to centuries of colonization and displacement in the New World. So for many, Columbus Day symbolizes those harms right there. That list of harms, rather than exploration or cultural pride. And this has led cities and states and organizations to replace the Columbus Day holiday with Indigenous Peoples Day, reframing the narrative to honor those who suffered and survived. Okay, I guess, right? I just wonder if people who get so worked up over Columbus Day, have paid any attention to the rest of human history. This is not a uniquely American story, not a uniquely Christopher Columbus story. This is how civilizations have always worked, how they've always spread. Look at the story of the Romans. Look at the story of Alexander the Great. Look at the story of the Mongols. Human rights and respect for other races is by far the exception to the spread of human history, definitely not the rule. There was evidence of the damage unleashed by Columbus on the Americas, the American continents, long before our modern era, but most Americans, they chose to look the other way. And that's what we often do with history, right? In 1828, Washington Irving He was a famous, I guess he would have been like the David McCullough of his time. Washington Irving wrote a popular biography of Christopher Columbus that kind of became the official definer of the myth of Columbus. The famous sailor, the admiral who was idealized alongside America's pioneering myths and archetypes. One version or another of Irving's biography was retold throughout the 19th century, all the way up to the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. That's when the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage was marked at that time. Now, it was around this time that critics, that contrarian historians began to chip away at the popular myth of Columbus, the popular narrative. New stories began to be written about, hey, this guy's Columbus, he wasn't really a good administrator, despite his discovery of the New World. There were accounts of his atrocities against the inhabitants of the Caribbean, and they began to circulate. And it was here that he was lifted up as the first Atlantic slave trader in the New World. That's when this began to be talked about in 1893. And so overall, these new pictures of Christopher Columbus, they began to create a more balanced image of the historical figure. In the book, The Worlds of Christopher Columbus, the authors, William Phillips Jr. and Carla Ron Phillips, they note that the irony is that most history books today rarely tell the real story of Columbus. In the 19th century, those stories focused on the ideal and the heroic character in people that people wanted to find in Columbus. This is a quote from that book, The Worlds of Christopher Columbus. They write, "A more critical attitude toward traditional heroes became prominent in the 1930s on, coupled with a trend away from seeing exemplary individual forces in history." The authors go on. They say, "The social activism of the 1960s gave rise to an emphasis on certain groups in American society that had been largely ignored in earlier textbooks, especially people of color. In short, the United States seems to have lost rather than gained knowledge about Columbus since 1892. Most people reach adulthood," this is what they're writing, these authors of this book, "most people reach adulthood with only the most rudimentary knowledge about him, half remembered from a few lessons in elementary school. Some recent debunkers of Columbus approached the evidence with a sense of triumphant outrage, angered by their assumption that the full story has been hiding from them. They respond like the child in all of us after discovering that trusted adults have withheld part of the truth. Their sense of betrayal is genuine and justified. Unfortunately, their approach often serves a particular political agenda rather than an informed search for truth." And the truth is, end of quote there, and the truth is that Columbus was neither as great as we have been told he was in some instances, and he was just as terrible as many of his contemporaries and other great figures of history are when we really dig into their lives and story. That's the nature of history. That's the nature of this fallen world, to be real honest with you. I attended a Christian school in grade school, and I too got a heavy dose of a specific narrative of Christopher Columbus's life. Right? Columbus saw himself as a servant of God, an ambassador of the Christian faith to bring the gospel and the light of Christ to this world. That's all true, to be honest with you. Okay, this is what I was taught in grade school, and it's actually true. When you read his letters and writings, you'll find them saturated with his conviction that he was called by God to sail the seas and represent the Christian faith. He wrote a book at one point in his life after the famous discovery of the New World, which is called the Book of Prophecies. And in the book, he scans Scripture to show himself and his work as the fulfillment of God's Word. He earnestly believed God called him to bring the gospel to new lands. Columbus's faith was a key driver in his life. His name meant Christ-bearer, and that's what he saw himself as. And guess what? All of that's true, okay? This is not a Christian myth pushed onto the historical record. It's absolutely factual. The problem is that all of these statements about Columbus's faith and honestly our modern reflection on his work lack the context necessary to really understand both his religion, his times, and what he felt he was accomplishing for God. And that context is critical, and it calibrates our understanding and definitions of Christopher Columbus. Keep in mind where we are in the timeline of world history and of Christianity here. This is 1492 when Columbus first set sail on the voyage when he would discover the New World. It's 25 years before Martin Luther would kick off the Protestant Reformation. and challenge the super levels of corruption and wickedness within the Catholic Church. It's difficult to say this moment or another moment was the apex of corruption within the Catholic Church. There were lots of them, but the times and church in which Columbus came of age in, they're certainly on the short list of possible inclusions for the apex of corruption within the Catholic Church. A few hundred years earlier, the Catholic Church had begun launching crusades into the so-called Holy Lands. And I say so-called Holy Lands because if you've listened to my podcast before on the history of the Middle East, I don't believe in Holy Land. Dirt is dirt. That's just the way it goes. That's another story, though. European Christians, they would go to Palestine during these crusades, Palestine and Syria. They would fight and kill the infidels, and they would be guaranteed forgiveness of their sins according to the church, the Christian church, the Catholic Church. And so as the new practices of European agriculture that I mentioned in the last episode brought forth new levels of prosperity, the kingdoms of Europe were slowly transitioning from a system of tribes and clans to a system of nation states, all supported, all legitimized by the Pope and the Church in Rome. And that legitimacy included the fighting of wars against the Muslims of the Middle East and an effort to reconquer or reconquest, that's an important word, reconquest the lands of Christendom that had been taken by the Muslims from the Christians. In fact, during the Crusades, the Vatican issued a new doctrine. Even though Jesus in the New Testament pushed pacifism and turning the other cheek, according to the papal court, there was a thing known as a just war. Now, several realities had to exist. According to this doctrine, several realities had to exist for a just war to take place. But the most important for our learning here was that the war, for it to be justified, it had to take place to regain lands that had once been in Christian hands. So, in the name of God, indeed, even under the banners proclaiming the cause of God, Crusaders launched one assault after another out of Europe and into the Middle East. And during the centuries preceding Columbus, these holy crusades became part and parcel to the Christian culture of Roman Catholic Europe. The warrior spirit of the Holy Crusader would soon merge with the self-image of the conquistador who came after Columbus into the New World. And all of this was seen as highly Christian, highly nationalistic, and highly favored by God because the church at that time said it was. So over the course of the centuries, in the fights between the Muslims of the East and the Christians of the West, victors in the battles would also lay claim to the survivors of their enemies, and they would name them as slaves. The word slaves, in fact, it comes from the word Slavs, referring to the Islamic region where most of these enslaved people came from. Again, all justified, all legitimized, and made holy by the Church in Rome. Well, Christopher Columbus was definitely a Christian, but he was not a Christian in the sense we usually understand it today. He was a devout, a staunch supporter of the Catholic Church and the regimes of Europe who aligned themselves to the popes of the 15th century. Now, he certainly did commit all sorts of atrocities from the modern perspective when he arrived in the New World, but he did so because that made sense, because that was endorsed by the Church, by his world, his culture at that time. It was the Ottoman Empire, the wicked forces of Islam, in their view, and these Europeans' view, that posed a barrier between Christian Europe and the treasures of jewels, silks, and spices in the eastern world of India and China. And Europe desperately wanted to access those lands of India and China and set up trade there. But the overland routes were terribly dangerous because of the Ottomans, the Muslim empire there. And this was the impetus that made Columbus's pitch for traveling east across the oceans, or west across the oceans, so appealing to the rising royal courts of Spain and Portugal. They wanted to trade, and they needed to find a way around the Ottomans to get to it. Now, highly important and indicative to all of these influences on the perspective of Columbus and the Christian explorers of his day was a series of wars and fights that spread out across the 15th century in the Canary Islands of the Atlantic Ocean. This was a war of reconquest. Remember that word? Reconquest. And it culminated just before Columbus's own historic voyage near the end of that century. The Canary Islands were a series of islands off the coast of West Africa. The nearly century-long warfare in those islands taught the Spanish how to subjugate people and how to colonize their lands. Pekka Hammarlund, in his book Indigenous Continent, he writes, "The lessons in cruelty and brutality that they learned, they being the Spanish, they learned in the Canaries would serve the Spanish adventurers well in the new world that was about to appear to them. The conquest of the Canaries had served as a laboratory of overseas imperialism, educating the Spanish in how to make strangers, subjects, even slaves. Now, Christopher Columbus was probably born in around 1451. We aren't honestly sure on the date. He was born in the Republic of Genoa, a thriving maritime center known for producing skilled sailors. He was the son of a wool weaver, a small merchant, and Columbus grew up in modest but an industrious household. Little is known, honestly, about his early childhood, but he later wrote that he first went to sea at the age of 10, and that began a lifelong relationship with navigation and with commerce. So by the early 1470s, Christopher Columbus was apprenticed as a business agent for prominent Genoese families, which sent him on trading voyages throughout the Mediterranean world. And those experiences sharpened his seamanship. They exposed him to the commercial networks that linked Europe to Africa and the Near East. And in 1477, he made this important decision to relocate to Lisbon. That's, modern Portugal. That was then Europe's leading hub of exploration. And that was where Portuguese mariners were pushing further down the West African coast during that time period, during this age of discovery. This was the dawning, in fact, of the age of discovery. And Columbus, in spite of his ambitions, his sense of spiritual calling, could never have imagined how big a role he was going to come to play in that age of discovery. In Portugal, Columbus married a noblewoman whose family had ties to Atlantic exploration. And through her, he was able to gain access to charts and knowledge of winds and currents in the Madeira and Azores regions. Those are things that most common people wouldn't have access to during that time period. So by the mid-1480s, Columbus had become convinced he could reach Asia by sailing west out into the Atlantic Ocean. And that was an idea he would spend years defending before he finally secured Spanish support to finance it. Now, contrary to popular myth, the popular myth we're often taught in grade school, neither Columbus nor most of his contemporaries, they didn't believe the world was flat. They believed the world was round and they could travel far. If they could travel far enough west, then they would eventually circle the globe and arrive at Japan and East Asia. So through the centuries, different pieces of evidence supported that theory of a round world. There were reports of unfamiliar limbs of trees washing ashore on the islands off the coast of Europe in the Atlantic, strange covered boats and canoes found drifting in the ocean, and these were all assumed to have come from some distant faraway islands in the Far East, right? And the Europeans wanted to go to the East. The problem was the length of the voyage. They could only sail their ships so far without replenishing their food, their fresh water, and they didn't know what all was out there, if it would just be a voyage to death. So as Columbus sailed through the Mediterranean and Western Europe, he collected all of these stories about strange items washing ashore on the beaches of Europe that presumably came from the East, and he began to build a theory about how far the shores of what we know as Japan today actually were from the shores of Europe. He calculated that it was 2,400 nautical miles from the Canary Islands to Japan. Now, he was wrong. The real distance is more than 10,000 nautical miles. But these kinds of theories, even though inaccurate, they weren't isolated to Columbus. Other sailors, other ambitious explorers, they had theories of their own. But what made Columbus different, no one pushed and persevered for support of such a discovering voyage like Columbus did. For a solid decade, he went from one court in Europe to another until he finally secured backing from the new king and queen, the new monarch of Spain. And his timing was perfect, if not divinely ordained. The new Spanish monarch, in league with the Catholic Church, was focused on the religious ideals of reconquest of the lands previously taken by the Muslims that we talked about. Spain had recently carried off this series of victories against the Muslims, again in the Canary Islands and elsewhere, and there was a sense that perhaps they could continue their push and erase Islam altogether. So Columbus advised that if he could make contact with the rulers of the East, they could build an alliance with Spain and drive Islam out of existence. He noted that all the profits from his journeys, those profits which he wouldn't keep, they should be put towards raising an army, an expedition to retake Jerusalem. So you can see all of these themes that have been echoed over the last couple of 100 years within the Catholic Church, these are dominant in the mindset, the perception of Christopher Columbus at this time. So with the king and queens of Spain's blessing, Columbus launched his fateful voyage from the Canary Islands toward the east in September 1492. Some tense moments at sea, but when many of his sailors wanted to turn back, but finally land was spotted in what we know today as the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. Columbus thought he had arrived in East Asia. In fact, until his dying breath, he would never publicly admit that he had discovered a new world. More than a full decade later, and after multiple voyages by Columbus and other sailors from Europe to the New World, it was Amerigo Vespucci in 1503 who explored the coastlines of the New World and published works that confirmed this was, in fact, not Asia, as Columbus believed it was, but it was a new continent. The continents of North and South America, they're actually named after that Italian sailor, Amerigo Vespucci. But Columbus was the first to make contact, or at least the first to tell others about his contact. Thinking he had arrived at the Indies Islands, he named the inhabitants Indians. And that's what they'd be called for the next 600 years, all the way to the present. He named his first landing site San Salvador, which means Holy Savior. And if Columbus had stopped right there, if that discovery itself had been enough, his legacy might be much less contentious today. But of course, he didn't stop. He returned to Spain. He was hailed as a hero, and the newly invented printing press published his letters and celebrated his discoveries, even if the discoveries still weren't quite understood. They didn't really know what he had found, what he had landed on. Modeling what Spain had done in the Canary Islands, Columbus pressed for his patrons, King Ferdinand, Queen Isabella, to colonize the islands that he had discovered and set up trade routes, even though he had seen hardly any treasure or of gold or jewels or silk or spices. He oversold the discovery big time to his patrons at that time. He assured them that there was land suitable and even perfect for gold mines, and that the treasure would come as soon as he could return. And so a second and a third voyage were financed for Columbus to go on. And this is when things turned south for him, really turned sour. Christopher Columbus's second and third voyages were marked by deep disappointment, largely because he had promised far more than he could deliver. After returning from his voyage with gold trinkets and parrots and captives, Columbus convinced Spain that vast wealth awaited them in the Caribbean. Investors, settlers, and the crown, they expected quick riches. But instead, the second voyage, launched with an enormous fleet of 17 ships and more than 1,000 men, they found no golden cities, only struggling settlements and rising indigenous resistance. So the small settlement he had left behind to be manned by sailors from his first voyage, it had already been destroyed by the time he got back on the second. And the new colony quickly descended into hunger, into disease and mutiny. And Columbus's assurances of gold, they proved hollow. His harsh governance only deepened resentment. And by the third voyage, this situation even got worse. Columbus again oversold the promise of treasure, persuading the monarchs to fund yet another expedition by claiming he would find lands rich in gold to the south. But the voyage once again produced little wealth, and his mismanagement in Hispaniola, marked by brutality, chaos, and political infighting, it led to widespread accusations against him. When he returned to Spain in 1500, 8 years after his first voyage, he faced charges of incompetence and of tyranny. Desperate to produce a return on the investments that they had made, the Spanish monarchs had invested in his voyages, in Christopher Columbus's voyages, and he began promoting capture. This was the idea. Since he couldn't find any gold, he began promoting capture of some of the natives and selling them into slavery. And there was a certain group of natives among some of the islanders that was highly feared among the others. These natives, the Caribs, were known to be cannibals and abominations in the eyes of Columbus and his crew, and they saw no problem with kidnapping these groups and shipping them into slavery, and as there was no hope for the gospel ever infiltrating their souls. So as Columbus continued to oversell the promises of fortune to his patrons, he was in greater need than ever to find a way to fulfill those promises. And it wasn't long before any of the natives found to resist Columbus and his militant evangelist sailors were assigned to the ranks of the Caribs and quickly sold into slavery. Right? So even if they weren't Caribs, if they resisted Columbus, they were put in that category, sold into slavery. Now this event, it went against the will and the orders of the Queen in Spain, who repeatedly ordered this practice to stop until the church in Rome could make an official ruling on whether or not it was okay to do. The historian Daniel Richter, he writes, rapidly replaying processes that had taken decades in the Canaries, the Spanish pitted one chieftain against another, and within a year imposed an impossible level of tribute on almost all the entire island population. On pain of death, every male over age 14 was to deliver up a hawk's bell full of gold dust every 3 months. The amount was about the volume of a thimble. Perhaps, just as important, the tiny bells were items, the tiny bells they had to fill. The tiny bells were items the Tainos had eagerly sought in trade with the newcomers. More just wars followed with a horrific death toll. From a population of perhaps 300,000 in 1492, an estimated 100,000 were dead by 1496, and 240,000 by 1508. All 60,000 survivors were subjected to encomienda, a system of forced labor that replaced the unworkable system of gold tribute in 1499. End of quote. So by the end of his third voyage, it was clear Columbus's letters and promises were little more than fantasy. There was no treasure to be found in the lands and islands he was discovering. Even worse, the mistreatment of natives was turning them against the Europeans and the gospel of Christ they claimed to represent. Violent atrocities were running rampant among the sailors and the settlers that came with Columbus to the New World. His fourth voyage to the New World would be his last. And although he maintained quite a personal fortune from his own voyages, by the end of his life, he had been stripped of so much of his titles and lost both favor and trust with the king and queen of Spain. Christopher Columbus, died on May 20th, 1506 in Valladolid, Spain, at the age of 54. At the time of his death, he was far from the celebrated figure he had once been upon his first discovery of the New World. Though he had opened the way for European expansion, Columbus died disappointed and diminished, believing he had been mistreated by King Ferdinand and denied the titles and the wealth he felt he deserved. His governorship had been stripped, his reputation damaged by accusations of misrule, and he never realized that he had actually encountered a whole new continent. Columbus died still insisting he had reached Asia, unaware of the world-changing scope of his voyage. Hey folks, I'm J.B. Shreve, and if you've followed this podcast, this blog, for any length of time, you know that one of the things I love is a deep dive into truth and to Scripture. I love to find application for my life in the here and now. Well, that's what my latest book represents. It's titled David, Poet, Warrior, King, and it's a deep dive into the biblical account of King David's life. If you think you know the story already, you might want to check again. This is more than the giant killer, more than the king, more than the guy who sinned with Bathsheba. This is a biblically based, factual account of the legend King David that towers over Scripture really like no one else does. This is one of the most enjoyable books I've written so far. What we do, we track David's origins, the early years in the fields, and ask questions that most people either ignore or miss when it comes to his family. We look at his life as an outlaw on the run from King Saul. We go into the kingdom years and how things actually began to fall apart after his moral failing. And in the background of all of these epic stories is the big question: why did God like this guy so much? If you haven't read the book yet, I want to encourage you, go get your copy today. You can find the links at the website, theendofhistory.net, or just go to Amazon and put it in your shopping cart today. David, Poet, Warrior, King by J.B. Shreve. This book was written for those who love studying Scripture, who want to go deeper, but also for those just discovering God's truth. David, Poet, Warrior, King. It'll leave a mark on your soul when you're finished reading it. For all the successes and failures of Columbus, he was really only the entry point of Europe and Spain into the New World. The atrocities that followed, they're pretty legendary. They're pretty well known to most of us who are familiar with this history. We're looking more at the story of America, but it's important to at least touch on what followed after Columbus in the regions of Central and South America, because they would take a toll on the story that unfolds further north and the lands that would become the United States of America. We'll look at that in the next episode. Columbus's initial reports out of Hispaniola, they ignited the imagination of Spain and unleashed a wave of ambitious adventurers who would come to be known as conquistadors. Now, these men, driven by a volatile mixture of greed, religious zeal, as well as personal ambition, they reshaped the Americas in ways that were both transformative and catastrophic. Columbus's early settlements in the Caribbean quickly became a staging grounds for further expansion. Hispaniola, or Little Spain, is one of the largest islands in the Caribbean. It included what we know today as Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and Columbus colonized this area beginning in 1493. It became the first laboratory of Spanish imperial rule. And so the indigenous populations there, initially welcoming, they soon faced forced labor, disease, rapid population collapse. The Spanish viewed indigenous populations as a crucial economic resource, and the early Caribbean colonies set the pattern for what would follow: extraction, coercion, and the imposition of Spanish authority, much like what had been done, again, in the Canary Islands off the western coast of the African continent. But the Caribbean was only the beginning. Tales of wealthy mainland empires whispered by indigenous captives, sailors, missionaries spread across the islands. These stories drew ambitious men who believed they could replicate or they could surpass Columbus's achievements. Now, no figure embodies the conquistador ethos more than Hernán Cortés, whose expedition to Mexico in 1519 became one of the most dramatic encounters in world history. Cortés arrived in the Yucatan with a small force, but he possessed two decisive advantages: steel weaponry and indigenous alliances. As he moved inland, he encountered the sophisticated and powerful Aztec Empire, ruled by Moctezuma II. Now, the Spaniards were astonished by the grandeur of this empire, of its main city, Tenochtitlan, a city of temples, gardens, canals that rivaled any European capital. But admiration quickly gave way to violence. Cortés took Moctezuma hostage, hoping to control the empire through its ruler. Tensions exploded during a religious festival when Spanish soldiers massacred hundreds of Aztec nobles, triggering a massive uprising. And the Spaniards fled the city. In this infamous massacre, they suffered heavy losses, but Cortés, he regrouped. And with thousands of indigenous allies, many of whom resented Aztec dominance, he besieged Tenochtitlan for months. And in 1521, after starvation, after disease and relentless assault, the city itself fell. And the conquest of Mexico, from that point on, it really became a template for future expeditions: exploit rivalries, seize leaders, and use superior weaponry and disease as force multipliers. Now, that goes back to a point that I made in the last episode. Empires like the Aztecs were on the verge of toppling already. Cortés and those conquistadors who followed him often managed to leverage the already existent disparities, the already existent frustrations among other tribes and subjects within the empire to topple the rulers there. So even if Cortés and his contemporaries offered really little real hope for a better life to those who allied with him, that was working for them. So if Cortés's conquest was astonishing, Francisco Pizarro's overthrow of the Inca Empire was even more improbable. In 1532, Pizarro arrived in Peru with fewer than 200 men. The Inca Empire, it was weakened by civil war, by smallpox, which had already spread ahead of the Spaniards. And this spread of disease is an important part of the story that we're going to come back to here in a minute. But at Cajamarca, Pizarro invited the Inca emperor to a meeting. And when the emperor arrived with thousands of unarmed attendants, the Spaniards launched a surprise attack. Cannons roared, horses charged, and steel cut through these unarmored bodies all around the emperor. The emperor, of course, was captured in the chaos. He offered a ransom of gold and silver so vast it filled a room that he was being held in. And yet, after receiving it, the Spaniards went forward and went ahead and executed him. By 1533, the Inca capital of Cusco fell, and Spain claimed one of the richest empires on earth by that point. Pizarro's conquest, like Cortés's, relied on deception, it relied on alliances, and the devastating impact of disease. The Spanish imposed systems of forced labor which demanded tribute and labor from indigenous communities. Entire regions were reorganized to serve Spanish economic interests, especially mining. The silver mines of Potosi, of Zacatecas, became engines of global commerce, enriching Spain while devastating indigenous laborers. So while Cortés and Pizarro achieved the most famous conquest, Countless others pushed into new territories. Hernando de Soto, he marched through the southeastern United States, encountering Mississippian chiefdoms and leaving destruction in his wake. Vasco de Balboa, he crossed the Isthmus of Panama, became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the Americas. Pedro de Alvarado, Cortez's lieutenant, he led brutal campaigns in Guatemala and El Salvador. Francisco Coronado, he explored the American Southwest in search of the mythical 7 cities of gold. Most of these expeditions, they failed to find the wealth that they sought, but they expanded Spain's geographical knowledge and laid the groundwork for future colonization. But again, the greatest impact was not just the atrocities of Spanish conquest, it was the diseases that the Spanish carried in their bloodstreams as they infiltrated the continents of the New World. The Black Death of earlier centuries in Europe had become part of the European DNA. Centuries of plague, smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, they had quite literally changed the immune system of the Europeans. Although it cost Europe nearly half its populations at different points in its history before this, by the time the Spanish arrived to the New World, they carried with them a secret biological weapon in their own bloodstream that devastated the civilizations of the Americas. These diseases spread rapidly among the indigenous populations who had no prior exposure, had no prior immunity. Historians describe these outbreaks as virgin soil epidemics, meaning entire communities were immunologically defenseless. Smallpox was the most catastrophic. It moved ahead of Spanish armies through trade routes and social networks, striking towns long before Europeans arrived. In many regions, mortality reached 70 to 90%. Think about that. 70 to 90% of the civilization was facing mortality by these diseases. It collapsed political structures, food production, spiritual life. All of those things just started to crumble. And so during the conquest of Mexico, smallpox swept through the Aztec capital, killing leaders, weakening armies, destabilizing the empire at the very moment that Cortez pressed his assault. The disease's impact was not limited to Mexico. Across the Caribbean, Central America, the Andes, North America, epidemics repeatedly tore through the indigenous societies. Between 1492 and the mid-1600s, some regions lost over 4/5, 80% of their population, a demographic collapse that was really unmatched in world history. And the spread of these diseases reshaped the conquest itself. It undermined resistance, emptied villages, created social upheaval that the conquistadors exploited. So while the Spanish wielded steel and horses, it was really disease, unseen, unstoppable, and often arriving before them, that became the decisive force in the transformation of the Americas. Now, as we come to a close in this episode, the reality of disease, the collapse of civilizations in the Americas, that has to be kept in mind. The explorers and the settlers that we're going to look at in the next couple of episodes, they often encountered villages that seemed abandoned, ghost towns of former civilizations and cultures, sometimes as far away as the northeastern United States, and it had spread all the way from the Spanish in Central America, where they had originated at 100 years earlier. And in many instances, the native civilizations themselves, even if they survived, they were severely shaken. Their gods had failed them. Their chiefs, their religious leaders had failed them. For the Indians of North and South America, this was quite literally the end of the world. And future generations, the Christian explorers, the settlers, would remind them of the weaknesses of their gods and point to the strength of their own God, never minding, and in fact not even understanding, how their own immune system of the Europeans had evolved over the past centuries. Now that's coming in the next episode, which should be available next week, a couple of episodes available next week as we begin to look to the age of settlement in the Americas. And we start to hone in on our story of the empire, an American story of 250 years. Thanks for listening, everyone.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.